Welcome to Introductory Politics. Today, we are talking about political parties in the United States. We are going to talk about what they are, how the two major parties developed in the modern era, and how party platforms and party identification help to shape American politics. A political party at the most basic level is an organization that seeks to control government by winning elections. Parties are used to recruit candidates, to organize political campaigns, to develop a policy agenda, and ultimately attempt to mobilize voters in order to get their candidates elected. Although the United States technically has many political parties, American politics has long been dominated by two major parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. This two-party system is strongly reinforced by American electoral institutions, especially the fact that we have single-member districts and plurality elections, where the candidate with the most votes wins. But while the two-party system is old and traditional in the United States, the modern versions of these parties is relatively recent, with most of what we think of among the Republican and Democratic parties to have taken shape mostly in the second half of the 20th century. The Democratic Party originated in the early 1800s, but the modern Democratic Party took shape mostly during the presidency and in the aftermath of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency in the 1930s. FDR's New Deal coalition brought together labor unions and urban voters, a number of racial and ethnic minorities, and many Southern voters under a policy platform that emphasized government intervention in the economy, social welfare programs, and various protections for workers. For the Republican Party, the party was founded in the 1850s, largely as an anti-slavery party, and was the party of Abraham Lincoln. In the 20th century, however, the party gradually became more associated with the ideas of limited government, free market economics, and a stronger emphasis on traditional social values. For several decades after the New Deal, Democrats were the dominant party nationally. Ultimately, though, the party began to change significantly during the civil rights era of the 1960s. When Democratic leaders began supporting civil rights legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, many white Southern voters who had historically supported Democrats started moving towards the Republican Party. And this ultimately helped produce the modern alignment of the parties. In the end, our first major Republican win after the Civil Rights Movement is in 1968 with a win by Richard Nixon. This ultimately is going to create what is called a realignment, where coalition members of one political party end up switching to another political party kind of en masse. In the early 1960s, conservative republicanism was mostly on the outskirts when it comes to national politics. The civil rights movement of the early 1960s and the Democratic Party's control of the narrative over in the 1960s helped lead to the establishment of the Democratic Party as a force throughout the 1960s. And this can be evidenced, for example, by the 1964 presidential election, when a Republican presidential candidate named Barry Goldwater lost big to the Democrat LBJ Lyndon B. Johnson in that presidential election by an electoral college vote of 486 to 52. 4 years later, though, Republican candidate Richard Nixon was able to win the presidency in the 1968 presidential election with 301 electoral college votes. So, why the sudden shift? Why the realignment? Nixon ended up campaigning as a law and order candidate. He presented himself as a voice for Americans who were frustrated by lots of protest and social unrest in major cities, the Vietnam War, and all of the controversy that surrounded that. And he called this group of people in the country the silent majority, and said that many voters felt that their concerns were not being adequately represented in national political debates and overall by the Democratic Party. Historians generally note that this did help some attract some voters who had previously supported Democratic candidates, and over time ended up contributing to a mass political realignment. Nixon would end up flipping most of the country electorally, where Republicans had lots of losses for a while, end up leading to a landslide victory in 1972, where he beat the Democratic candidate with an electoral college vote of 520 to 17. However, Nixon's resignation after the Watergate scandal in 1974 proved damaging to Republicans in the short term, which ultimately led to Jimmy Carter winning the presidential election in 1976. However, while all of this was going on, there was still a growing conservative political movement that was able to keep and gain momentum in the late 1970s. Organizations that were associated with this kind of emerging religious right movement was able to mobilize voters that were concerned about the role of traditional religious values in public life. And at the same time, many Americans were still frustrated by things like rising crime rates, a larger drug culture, an acceptance of drug culture and drug use, and other economic challenges. International events also contributed to this public dissatisfaction, especially the long crisis that surrounded the Iran hostage crisis in the late 1970s, and ultimately led for policymakers to advocate for a more assertive role when it came to foreign policy and a larger kind of role for the United States in global affairs in general. In the late 1970s, Republicans were largely able to corner that market of ideas on this larger role within a global society, and led to further wins by Republicans. With this, leaders like Ronald Reagan argued that the existing model of large federal government, large social programs didn't actually do well in effectively addressing the country's economic challenges and the country's political and social challenges. So Ronald Reagan instead argued that a vision that emphasized lower taxes, smaller government with reduced regulations, but with a strong national defense would help the country kind of move forward. So Reagan's kind of conservative market-based economic policies focused on individual responsibility became the starting point for a durable political coalition that contributed to his victories in 1980 and in 1984. This does end up spilling over, however, into the 1988 presidential election that helped to get George H.W. Bush elected in 1988. Overall, when it comes to party coalitions and the evolution of our two major parties in the United States, this largely begins in the 1960s and 70s. Republicans were able to successfully attract conservative voters, mostly in the South and in suburban parts of the country. And this shift accelerated during the presidency of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. This ultimately creates a pretty solid a Republican conservative political coalition that emphasizes tax cuts, deregulation, strong national defense, and the elimination or at least reduction of many federal social programs. However, the Democratic Party has focused on a completely distinct ideology that has focused on, again, these kind of large government responsibilities, major social programs, and a bit more government intervention in the economy. Because of these two divergent ideological interests, Democratic Party support tends to be strong from urban voters, from non-white voters, and from younger voters. With the Republican Party's position on more limited government and low taxes, this tends to receive strong support from rural voters and suburban voters. And in its social policy, many white evangelical Christians. Much of what these political parties now consistently tried to do is focus on solidifying those coalitions and changing them only when it's really needed to address current events. One of the ways that these coalitions are solidified and one of the ways that they evolve over time is through the use of a party platform. A party platform is one of the key ways that a political party is going to communicate their priorities and their policy preferences. A party platform is an official statement provided by the party that outlines the goals and principles of that party. These platforms are typically written and adopted during the party's national convention that happens once every 4 years, and typically voted on when the party formally nominates their presidential candidate. These platforms do not have the force of law. They don't bind any elected officials to anything, but they can be informative by serving a few different purposes. One of these is to signal priorities. Party platforms are able to tell voters what the party believes in, what they stand for. They also allow parties to kind of unite groups. These coalitions of voters are really important for political parties. And a platform is able to essentially extend bits and pieces of kind of elements of what's going to sound good to a particular piece of their coalition. So that in the end, when you combine all of the different elements of these party platforms, which are typically 50 to 60 pages long, that it ends up showing how different segments of society are able to eventually come together and compromise towards a common goal. Lastly, these party platforms serve as a quick and easy tool by political candidates to be able to express certain messages. Political party candidates don't necessarily have to develop a well thought out, well researched stance on an issue. They can simply rely on what the political party believes and use that research and that evidence in order to help build their own beliefs. And when they do that, they are able to effectively communicate to potential voters that, say, belong to that political party as to why they should be voted for. For example, recent Democratic platforms have emphasized a number of policies, such as expanding access to healthcare, addressing climate change and other climate related policies, protecting the right to vote and expanding the ability for people to vote, and strengthening labor protections. Republican platform ideas have emphasized again this idea of lower taxes, less federal regulation, stronger border enforcement and border control, and expanded domestic energy production. However, although party platforms are able to talk about these different policy ideas, these platforms are broad. They are aspirational. They are intended to capture and mobilize large groups of people within their coalition. And so while they do talk about, say, lower taxes, they may not necessarily go into all of the detail of which taxes should be lowered, how much should taxes be lowered. A lot of those kinds of details are left to individual candidates and other dynamics within the political environment. So, how effective is this? When it comes to party platforms and campaign messaging, party messaging to voters, how effective is this in the end? This is what party identification ultimately is trying to tell us. Party identification refers to a voter's psychological attachment to a political party. Another way of thinking about this is about how much someone believes they belong to a party. This is not just about voting for a party or voting for a candidate of a party in a single election, but rather a long-term sense of loyalty or overall affiliation with that party. In the United States today, when we think about party affiliation or party identification, we think about the public being divided into basically three big groups: Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. While independents are not a party in the United States, we essentially identify those who are not Democrats or Republicans as independents. However, many people who do call themselves independents do still lean towards one of the two major parties. So you may have people who are Democrats. You may have people who are independents but lean Democrat. And so a lot of independents tend to find themselves in one of those two categories, either leaning Democrat or leaning Republican. Party identification matters because it is one of the strongest predictors of voting behavior. People who strongly identify with a party are very likely to vote for that party's candidate across multiple elections, over multiple years, across multiple different positions of power that can be elected, etc. For example, someone who identifies as a strong Democrat will usually vote for a Democratic candidate for president, not just over the long term, but also for Democratic candidates for Congress, Democratic candidates for many state offices, and the same pattern is true for Republicans. When it comes to party identification in the United States, although this does change over time, the general distribution of the public is fairly consistent. One of the things that we can see here overall, and this is just taking a look at data over the past approximately 5 to 6 years, is what party affiliation looks like overall. And so, if we were to break down public responses when it comes to affiliation into just three categories, to say Republican, Independent, and Democrat. One of the things that we would see is that closer to 2020, we saw a relatively stronger position of affiliation of party identification for Democrats. And so when it came to 2020-ish party affiliation, we saw that about half of members of the public were Democrats, and that was those who were kind of solid Democrats and those who were maybe say independent but leaned Democrat. On the other end of the spectrum, those who leaned Republican or are kind of more solidly Republican, we saw that at around 43%. However, the closer we got to 2025, including the years of 2024 and 2025, we see that this is kind of flipped. That more of the country is Republican than they used to be, I would identify as Republican than they used to. Now, Republicans do have a bit of an advantage here, where we see the data here, for example, saying that about 46% of the country is Republican and about 45% of the country would affiliate with the Democrats. Although the Republicans do have a lead, we could essentially call this a tie. And so while Democrats did used to have a fairly strong majority, I don't know, it's not a majority, but it's a fairly strong lead among the public when it came to those who identify as Democrats, this is now essentially turned into more of a 50-50 split in the United States. When we break down this number and take a look at party identification by different demographics, we see, again, kind of some consistent trends here. Overall, men are more likely than not to support Republican candidates. We can see here that, for example, this is, again, the gap might be a bit more narrow at some points in time or a bit wider at some points in time. But on average, overall, men tend to identify as Republican. We can see here, for example, in our most recent years, let's say 2024 and 2025, that more than 50%, just a little bit more, but more than 50% of men tend to identify as Republican. And this is now down to about 40% that tend to identify as Democrat. For women, we see essentially the exact opposite. Now, again, the overall kind of evolution of this over time is going to fluctuate, of course, where again, in some cases, it's a bit wider of a gap, in some cases, it's a bit more narrow. But what we see here is that women tend to prefer Democrat. Women tend to identify as Democrat. That roughly half of women consider themselves to be Democrat, and around 40% of women consider themselves to be Republican. When we take a look at age demographics and how we see party identification by, say, age cohort, this is where we start to see some really interesting trends. One of the things that we can see here, for example, when it comes to what we would call youth voters in general, this would be ages of 18 to approximately 29, that historically, younger voters tend to overwhelmingly support Democratic candidates. But in our most recent years of, say, 2024 and 2025, it's a much more narrow gap. We can see in 2024 that young voters tended to, at least more than Democrats, tended to identify as Republican more so than Democrats. Although it was basically tied, this was a year where we did see more Republican identifiers among the youth than we would in other years. Now in 2025, again, this tends to return kind of back to what is typical in the data, where those who are in this age category generally identify as Democrats, but again, the gap is quite narrow. When we go to a slightly older age demographic, the age demographic of 30 to 49, we see a really interesting story here, which is that it's basically split 50-50. If we ignore all of the independents or those that have no real affiliation to a political party. If we ignore those, we see that it is fairly neck and neck. It's fairly 50-50, where half of adults in this age category identify as Republican and half identify as Democratic. In 2022 and 2023, based on this data, those numbers were essentially identical. So we do have a little bit of a gap, but this is basically a 50-50 split among this age demographic. When we go to the next older age demographic of voters aged 50 to 64, we start to see again a switch where those who were 18 to 29 are more likely to be Democratic leaning or identify as Democrats. Those who are 30 to 49, basically 50-50. Those who are age 50 to 64 are certainly more likely to be Republican. Based on this data, we see that in general, roughly half of adults who are in this age demographic, in this age category, consider themselves to be Republican, with a little bit more than 40% consider themselves to be Democrat. When we go to our oldest age category of those who are age 65 and older, we see again something interesting here, that it's basically 50-50. Roughly half of adults in this age category identify as Republican and half identify as Democrat. So overall, we see this really interesting picture where you have youth voters who tend to be overwhelmingly, in a sense, youth voters tend to overwhelmingly be affiliated with or identify with the Democratic Party. And then you see this flip a bit when you get into that 30 to 49 age demographic. But then after that, it's kind of 50-50 between our older age demographics. When we take a look at this overall and break this down kind of at the junction of age and sex in particular, one of the things that we can see here is again some variation when it comes to party identification. For example, in that youngest age cohort of 18 to 29, where we saw that overall, most of the time, youth voters tend to identify as Democrats. That's really only true for young women. Young women tend to overwhelmingly support Democrats. However, young men tend to support overwhelmingly Republicans. In the 30 to 49 age category among men, we see the same kind of thing. That men within this age category tend to identify as Republican, women tend to identify as Democrat. Overall, we see this in every single age category with certain degrees of variation. So, for example, in the 50 to 64 age category, women are virtually split evenly between Democrat and Republican. They only slightly favor Democrat rather than Republican in the oldest age category. And so, while there is some variation, we could say in general overall that this is pretty consistent. So this is one way that we can take a look at political parties is by taking a look at how well they are able to establish these coalitions, how well they are able to maintain these coalitions, and how these coalitions do change over time.